Hi, I'm Alex with Simple DSLR and wanted to make this quick video to show you how to use a digital SLR camera like this. Now it can be a little overwhelming and intimidating at first by using all the features on a camera like this, but believe it or not, it's very easy if you understand three main concepts of what makes these cameras work. And that's the shutter, the aperture, and the ISO. There's also white balance, but I'll do a separate video for that. And for what these mechanisms do, they also have certain side effects, and it's those side effects that unlock all the cool creative possibilities that you can do in photography. For example, the shutter controls duration, and the side effect of that is motion blur. The aperture controls the quantity of light, and the side effect of that is depth of field. The ISO controls the sensitivity of the image sensor, and the side effect of that is noise. Let's look at these in detail. We'll start with the shutter. The easiest way to take control over just the shutter is to put the camera into shutter priority mode on the mode dial. And that's TV for Canons, which stands for time value, and S for shutter on the Nikons. So when you put your camera into shutter priority mode, what happens is you take control over just the shutter, and your camera figures out your aperture and your ISO automatically in order to produce the correct brightness level in your image. And by the way, that brightness level is called exposure. The other priority mode, AV for Canons or A for Nikons, the aperture priority mode, does the same thing but for the aperture. You take control over the aperture manually and the camera figures out shutter and ISO automatically for you. Now be aware that on some cameras the ISO setting is not automatic unless you put it in automatic mode. So check your manual to see if your camera has a fully automatic ISO setting or if you have to manually set that even if you're in one of the priority modes. The manual mode gives you control over everything manually, so you're going to have to use your camera's light meter in order to make sure that you've set the proper exposure for your image. And P for program mode is just an automatic mode where the camera figures out everything automatically. So that's basically the mode dial. Now let's go back to the shutter and shutter priority mode. So the way your camera works is all the way in the back you have an image sensor which is light sensitive, and before the digital image sensor that was film. And right in front of that image sensor is where the shutter sits, and that shutter is a curtain that opens and closes to expose that image sensor to light so that way it can capture your image. So to show you the shutter, what I've done is taken the lens off this camera, and you can see it there. And if we take a picture, you can see that shutter opening and exposing the sensor to light. So when you're adjusting your shutter settings in shutter priority mode, what you're really adjusting is the duration that that curtain is open and exposes the sensor to light. Now if we look at our LCD screen of our camera, we're going to see a set of numbers. The first set of numbers is the shutter speed. You can also see these numbers if you look through the camera's viewfinder. They'll be at the bottom or on the side somewhere. And these numbers represent fractions of a second. So right now we're set to 1/80th of a second. And that's a very small amount of time. So if we take the picture like that, the shutter opens for 1/80th of a second and we can barely see it here. But if we lower it to, let's say, 1/4 of a second, it's going to be open for a longer period of time, 1/4 of a second. If we take a picture like that, you can briefly see it there. But if we go to an even more of an extreme, let's go to 2 seconds, for example. If we take the picture like that, you'll see that shutter being open for 2 seconds. And that's all the shutter settings do. They control the amount of time that the shutter is open and exposes the sensor to light. Now moving on to motion blur, which is the side effect of the shutter, you have to think about what's happening when that shutter is open and is exposing the sensor to light. See, you're not doing a movie where you're capturing multiple frames per second, so you're getting that motion and playback in those multiple frames per second. You're actually taking only one frame, so if you have motion while you're taking that picture, you're going to capture it in the form of a blur. In addition to your subject moving, think about if your camera is moving while you're doing that. Again, you're going to capture motion blur. From a creative standpoint, let's have this motorcycle pass in front of us, and as that happens, if we take a picture at a fast shutter speed, and that's going to be a very short amount of time that that shutter is open for, you're going to freeze motion because you're capturing a very short sliver of time. Now if we do the same thing with a slower shutter speed, having that shutter speed open for a longer period of time, you're going to capture motion blur in the background, giving you an effect of speed. Okay, so moving on to the aperture. The aperture is an iris that sits inside your lens, and it opens and closes to control the quantity of light. So we'll switch our camera into aperture priority mode, giving us control over the aperture, and the camera figures out shutter automatically. And it's the second set of numbers that are the aperture numbers. And bigger numbers will mean that you have a smaller opening of the iris, as you see here. And if we lower the numbers, the iris gets bigger and opens up more and lets more light in. Now you might have noticed that when I changed the aperture setting around, it affected the shutter speed. The shutter speed changed with it. And that's what's supposed to happen, because your camera is going for a correct exposure, a correct level of brightness, and when I change one setting, because the camera figures the other ones automatically, it compensates with shutter or ISO to create the same amount of exposure in our image. So there is this trade-off property in between these three different mechanisms, and I'll talk about this at the end of the video. Now the side effect of the aperture is depth of field, and depth of field is the area that's in focus, and it's what will get you that blurry background in your photograph, so you'll get an effect of this with a blurred background in a portrait shot versus one where you're getting more of that background in focus. By taking a picture with a small aperture setting, a small f-stop number, meaning that your iris is going to be open to a larger size, you're going to get a narrow area that's in focus, a smaller area that's in focus, that's in that depth of field area. But if you increase your aperture numbers, that will decrease the size of the aperture, and therefore it'll widen the area that's in focus, giving you less of a blurred background effect. If I take a picture with a high f-stop number, a high aperture setting, like this, we're going to get more in focus. The background is in focus, the foreground is in focus. But if we lower that aperture setting to a smaller number, meaning that the aperture size will be bigger, and take the picture like that, we're going to have a blurred foreground and background, making a smaller area that's in focus, a smaller depth of field area. And the final mechanism that we can control is the ISO. The ISO is a way to make the image sensor more sensitive. So if you dial higher ISO numbers, you're going to make that image more sensitive to light. Now the side effect of high ISO settings is noise. And noise is less of a desired, a creative side effect, and is more of a undesired effect that you have to deal with when you're taking pictures at high ISO settings. And when you take pictures with high ISO settings, you lose the quality in your image. You get these artifacts and loss of detail. And the reason you would need to take pictures at high ISO settings is, for example, when you're in low light conditions, you want to make the image sensor more sensitive to light, so you're able to trade that off for shutter speed. So that way when you're taking an image, you're not susceptible to motion blur at lower shutter speed. So you're trading that off. You're buying yourself more shutter speed by making the image sensor more sensitive, but having to deal with noise in your images. And this leads me into that trade-off property that I mentioned to earlier in between these three mechanisms. So there's a relationship between these three mechanisms. If you're leaning more towards one of these mechanisms' side effect, you're going to have to give from the other two in order to maintain the same level of brightness, the same level of exposure. And you have to keep that in mind, because all these three mechanisms do is they control how much light is being absorbed by the image sensor. You've got the shutter, which controls duration, aperture controls quantity, and ISO controls the sensitivity of the image sensor. Well, that's basically all there is to a camera and to exposure. If you understand these three concepts, the shutter, the aperture, and the ISO, you really understand everything about the camera, because that's really all there is. All the bells and whistles, all the other features are all built around these three. I realize there's a lot of information to take in a short video like this, so I put up several videos on my website, simpleDSLR.com, and they're all separated in separate videos, a little more detailed and broken down and at a slower pace. So if you like this, you'll definitely enjoy those. They're all free, and I know you'll gain some more knowledge from them. There's a link to those videos in the description of this video right below. So check that out, and I hope to see you there.